In this lesson, we're going to look at transport. So, how do organisms move materials? As a review, remember cells need to maintain homeostasis. The plasma membrane is selectively permeable, so only certain things can go in and out. And enzymes require energy in order to work. Also, remember, the solute is the thing that gets dissolved, the thing that you put in. So that would be like the salt or the sugar. The solvent is the thing that does the dissolving. So in this case, we're mostly talking about water. So why do cells have to move stuff? Well, homeostasis. That requires materials to be either moved in or out. Communication is the same way. Cells use materials and chemicals to communicate. Reactions. You need to get the reactants to the reaction and the products away. So we're going to look at two different types of transport, and the first one of these is passive transport. And passive transport means that you're moving things without adding any energy. The word passive means no energy. Alright, so we don't need any ATP or anything like that for passive transport to happen. So the examples of passive transport, and you definitely got to remember that these go together, are osmosis and diffusion. Osmosis and diffusion are both passive transport, meaning they don't require any energy. So first let's look at diffusion. Diffusion means that molecules are going to move from a high to a low concentration. Basically, that means, now here we have, in the corner, we have molecules in a very high concentration. They're very packed together. They are going to move or spread out into a lower concentration until they reach basically equilibrium. This is why if someone sprays perfume or something in the corner of a room, eventually everyone will smell it. We didn't have to add any energy for that to happen. It's just the natural movement of the molecules. They spread out. So again, molecules spreading out without needing any energy added is diffusion. Now, diffusion can also occur across a membrane. So this will occur if the molecule is small enough to actually go through the membrane. So here we have a situation where we have the cell membrane in the middle, and we have a much higher concentration on the left than on the right. So since molecules are going to go from high to low, the molecules will move towards the right, and they will spread out until they reach equilibrium, meaning that the concentrations are equal on both sides. Now let's look at osmosis. Osmosis is similar, but it involves water moving across what we call a semi-permeable membrane. And in this case, we're going to be talking about the plasma membrane. Now, it's called semi-permeable because water can actually pass through it. It's small enough, and water can easily pass back and forth across the membrane. The solute, however, is too big, and it can't. So semi-permeable, selectively permeable basically mean kind of the same thing. What we're saying just in this case is water can move through the membrane and the solute can't. So how does osmosis work? Water is actually going to go from low to high solute concentration. The way to remember this is simply water moves to the higher number. And it's really easy to do if you look at it this way. So here we have an example. I have my semi-permeable membrane in the center. There's water on both sides, and in that water is solute. Now notice, On the left side, there's a much higher concentration than the right side. Water is going to move to the higher number. So that means it's going to move to the left, because that's where there's more solute. So if we use this line to represent our original water level, the water, you can see, has actually moved to the left to try to equal out the concentrations. So inside cells, what can happen? Well, we're going to see that cells will swell or shrink based on these concentrations as water moves in and out. And so you're going to need to be able to identify, based on situations, is the cell going to swell, shrink, or stay the same? So here's an example. Here we have our cell. There's water inside and outside of it, and there's solute on the inside and the outside. Now, obviously, there's a much higher concentration outside than inside. So, since water goes to the higher number, water is going to move out. And it's just like if you let water out of a water balloon. If there's less water in the balloon will shrink. And the cell will do the same thing. The cell will actually shrink. Now notice, none of the dots moved. The solute never moves. It's only the water. And one of the ways that I kind of think of this is, think about putting salt on a slug. The salt pulls the water out of the slug. And that's the way it works. Basically, the solute is pulling the water in the direction of where the higher concentration is. So if you pour salt on a slug, there's a lot more salt outside, it pulls the water out, and the slug will shrivel up. So let's look at these three scenarios. We have three different cells in a solution that is 50% solute. Now, inside this cell is 25, this cell is 50, and this cell is 75. So in this first cell, we have more salt outside the cell than inside. In the second one, they're equal, and in the third one, there's more salt inside. So remember, water goes to the bigger number, which means in number 1, the water moves out. In number 2, the water is going to move in and out at the same rate because they're equal. And in number 3, the water is going to move in. So what effect does that have on the cell? Well, if the water moves out, the cell is going to shrink. If the water is moving in and out at the same rate, it's going to stay the same. And if the water is moving in, the cell is going to swell. Now let's look at active transport. So active transport, remember, being active means you got energy, you're using energy. So active transport means you're using energy to move stuff. And that means ATP is going to be involved. And we're going to call this moving against the concentration gradient. And we'll look at this here in just a second. So a concentration gradient means slope. So it's a difference in a concentration. So notice the picture on the left has a very high concentration gradient. There's a really big difference between the concentrations on either side. And so I've represented this by a very steep slide, meaning that things are going to go down very quickly. On the right, we have a much lower concentration gradient. There's not as much of a difference. So that's like a less steep slide. So if you're moving down the slide or down the river, it's passive. You don't have to do anything. You just let go and gravity takes over and you go down the slide. However, if you wanted to go up the slide, you're going to use active transport because you got to actually use energy to get up the slide or to move up the river. So a lot of times we talk about active transport like pumping. You actually have to pump water uphill, but it will passively flow downhill. So what are some examples of active transport? Your muscles contracting. That is, the movement of materials requires energy. Your neurons firing. Making ATP. All of these things within your body are done with active transport. And so how does this work? Well, here we have a membrane, and here we have what's called a transport protein. It's going to move stuff across a membrane. So here's my molecule. It's going to go into this transport protein. Then we're going to use ATP in order to actually cause that protein to change shape. It needs energy to be able to change its shape. But now it is able to release that molecule onto the other side of the membrane. And so basically by this way, it's using energy to move materials across this membrane.